Assalamu alaikum. Nice to be here. Bismillah. Well, I thought I would begin first by talking a little bit about who I am in a way that a guy I met last year, in fact, in Malaysia, began one of his talks, which I found very engaging, talking about himself at a human level first. Well, my name is Harry Fear. I'm going to be 26 on the 26th of next month, which I just love the symmetry of that. It's so cool. I love it. I work for RT as a full-time as a TV correspondent based in London. I recently had a failed dental operation. It's really been a nightmare. And I also have a rare bone disease as well. I was born in Oxford, and I now live in London. And I sometimes wear makeup for work, obviously. Well, in the way that I do, I kind of left preparation for this talk to the last minute. I spent weeks obsessing about what I was going to talk about and really couldn't find quite exactly what to talk about. So last night, having had a half-written speech in front of me, which I found far too dry and unengaging, I decided I would set myself the challenge of coming up with a talk 20 minutes before speaking to you today, which I haven't done, just to manage your expectation. I have prepared a little better. But the reason why I did this was because last week I spoke at the MSc conference, and it was another event seeking to inspire and engage. And I said to people, sometimes you just have to close your eyes, jump through the door frame, and hope for the best. And I thought that I'd be a real hypocrite if I didn't try and do the same thing today. And professionally speaking, sometimes with RT, I'm sent to a random place at an hour's notice, and I sometimes end up with 15 minutes or even literally seconds notice about what I'm meant to talk about live on air to goodness knows how many people are watching, sometimes perhaps hundreds of thousands, and the audience of RT is something in the hundreds of millions in terms of capacity. So something like preparing at the last moment is something I'm used to. One of the reasons why it was difficult for me to know what to talk about today was, and I was looking at some talks I have given in the past last night. Well, in some ways, nothing's changed since I began doing advocacy talks a few years ago. It's now 2015. In 2013, I was on a television interview, and I was asked what we're seeing in the West Bank and Gaza at that time, is that the third intifada? And I said, no, I don't think so. The reason at that time I cited was because I don't think Israel wants to see a third intifada at now, and it has the power to dominate on the ground and affect what it wants to a large extent at that particular time. 2014, I was asked the same question in another television interview, do you think now is going to be the third intifada? And I said no, and George Galloway said he disagrees with me, and I was right. I'm joking, but last night I was meant to have a radio interview, and I was due to be asked the same question. Do you think now is going to be the third intifada? And I guess to begin on this depressing note, you can see little has changed. This week I found a bit of a mind-blowing week being a UK citizen. I first went to Gaza in part because I wanted to do something meaningful with my life. I felt quite disillusioned with the political scene here in the UK in my early 20s. And I guess if I was in my early 20s now, maybe I'd be a little bit more engaged with the UK political scene. Well, what's happened this week? Well, we found out more Calais migrants or refugees, so to speak, have died trying to get into the UK. The UK, according to one report, spends £1 million a day trying to keep these migrants or refugees out and at bay. It spends £7 million on a fence to try to keep them at bay. Having visited the Calais jungle camp, as it's known, and I will be again on Monday, it really feels like the Hunger Games. And we are living in District 1, if I've got that right. It really is like that. And that's a theme I'm going to draw back on later. I just realized I didn't actually start this. Typical. Unbelievable. In a speech in January in Malaysia, I talked about journalists and language and how we use, or in the industry generally, we use bizarre language. Suddenly radical becomes extremist. Suddenly it's the same thing as terrorist. Suddenly it's the same thing as Islamist. And these terms are used almost as synonyms, which is, of course, against all logic. But you can see this is a rule of the game of news, particularly television news. Looking at what's happened in the UK this week, I think we can draw on that theme. And first, I would just draw on a quote from one of my most inspirational figures. He's now died, but Harold Pinter, British Jewish playwright. And he said a few years ago, roughly quoting him, "On the evidence available to us, politicians are not interested in truth, but in power and in the maintenance of that power. To maintain that power, it is essential that people remain in ignorance, that they live in ignorance of the truth, even the truth of their own lives. What surrounds us, therefore, is a vast tapestry of lies upon which we feed." Looking at the UK political scene and discussions this week, I was reminded of this quote. Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday. I was shocked and appalled and really ashamed, actually, to be British. I was with, at the time, a Hungarian cameraman who works for RT, and we were travelling back from, I can't remember where, Yorkshire or something like this, and we were watching Prime Minister's questions live, and we had people's questions, literally people's questions, being put to the Prime Minister, David Cameron. And MPs in the House were laughing at people's questions. This shows the disconnect between the political reality and the reality of those that work in television news as well, by the way, for example, and ordinary people's lives. Now, I'm personally a moral conservative. I'm not a supporter of the Conservative Party, neither am I a supporter of the Labour Party. But I do think that Jeremy Corbyn is something of a prophet figure in this whole scene that I've tried to depict. He's there putting forward ordinary people's questions to power, and they are laughed at. Question time, Thursday night, similar scene. A woman in the audience confronts a Conservative MP minister, even, I believe, saying, "Why are you taking away, essentially, my tax credits? I work hard to provide for my family. Shame on you. I voted for you to look after the economy, but you're not." Very emotional scene. And it doesn't happen often in the UK political scene. But there's a trend here, and perhaps some hope can be drawn by these small examples of truth confronting power. Jeremy Corbyn, as a prophet-like figure, if you will, and not to romanticize it, but to try and draw hope from that, is trivialized. Airtime is given to his tie, to his jacket, even on the BBC headline news sometimes. What he wears seems to be more important than families suffering and his politics to try to combat that. He's been called a security-threatening, terrorist-sympathizing, Britain-hating figure by David Cameron, because he referred to Hamas and Hezbollah as our friends in trying to open dialogue with them. Now, for those that work in the TV news industry and those in the political theatre of the UK, Jeremy Corbyn is a real frustrating figure because he makes people actually think. He actually brings up questions that people ought to hear. And that confronts the cozy reality of newsmakers and those that decide the editorial line of TV channels and those in Westminster itself. I interviewed Jeremy Corbyn a couple of days before he was elected as the leader of the opposition. And my main takeaway from the experience, apart from him being charming and etc., this is all superficial, who cares? He was asked a question by another journalist about the refugee crisis. He said, amongst his sentences of reply, "After all, they are human beings." How extraordinary, but it's extraordinary that he even said that. That's the climate we're living in. This week also we learned that the US actually apparently bombed the hospital in Afghanistan in Kunduz deliberately, having assessed that there was some kind of Taliban operative inside. And also, of course, this week, the development, so to speak, of the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict. News channels, the BBC included, and I'm a hater of the BBC somewhat, so I'm open about it, likes to simplify what's happening on the ground to avoid as much as possible bringing up any historical context at all. One stone was thrown, they would read to try and avoid actually talking about why the stone may have been thrown. They focus on the facts on the ground, almost obsessively, and ask ridiculous questions. BBC journalists to, for example, Benjamin Netanyahu, I think on Thursday, what about the peace process is one of the questions asked by a BBC journalist. What peace process? What planet are you living on? And in fact, that is what Benjamin Netanyahu said to the BBC journalist. Talking about context, historical context, talking about motives to the bloody developments, the moment in Israel-Palestine. Having been to Gaza several times, I think 6 or 7 times, I can't remember, having spent time in Gaza, perhaps I can shed a little bit of light onto this matter of context. Needless to say that it's an occupation is the primary context that should be explained to what's developing in Israel-Palestine at present. And having spent time living in Gaza, I obviously made the acquaintance of people from all different sorts of backgrounds, from all different sorts of factions, from all different sorts of walks of life, including young men who have fired rockets, including young men who have injured themselves firing rockets but survived. One of my most inspirational figures is an American journalist called Chris Hedges, and he brings up the issue of resistance in a Western political context, talking about activism and such. But in fact, his words, which I will read in a moment, can be absolutely applied to the motivation of those throwing stones, throwing Molotov cocktails, and those even, in some cases, firing rockets, perhaps, I would suggest. Resistance is a way of protecting our own worth as an individual, our own dignity, our own self-respect. Resistance always leaves open the possibility of change, and if we don't resist, we've essentially extinguished that hope. It's interesting because saying that, if someone listens to me bringing that up, in the UK context, people will immediately think I'm supporting terror, which is so interesting, because talking about the explanation for something is, of course, not to give moral credence to it, or to support it, or to condone it, or to try and encourage it, but to surely understand why violence may happen is an obligation, particularly for journalists, particularly for those who have met those committing violent acts, and to try the best we can to communicate that to audiences. When I was younger, I was obsessed with the idea that intellect means nothing unless it has a compassionate intention in application. We can be as smart as we want, but if we don't actually mean to set out in our lives and do something to help humanity, to help the global ummah, as some would reference it, then it's a totally wasted power. In an encyclical in the last couple of years, Pope Francis has said that in the West we are accustomed to the suffering of others. Me, myself, having been to Gaza during 2 wars and seen Gaza outside of wartime and been to various other countries with crises, I myself have had the honor of witnessing firsthand the parallel universes of reality, of suffering that many people live in. When I was a younger man, I would... Thank you so much. I would... so young, he said, still young. I would tune in to a live stream from Gaza to try to be there, to try to accustom myself to the suffering of others in the other meaning of the phrase, if if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. I wanted to be there as much as I could, to immerse myself and embed myself and try to sympathize as much as I could. I would hear the Israeli helicopters fire. I would hear them go overhead on this live stream. This is all before I ever first visited Gaza. In the last week, we've seen some inspiring messages coming from Gaza. One video particularly, I cannot remember the young man's name, but very courageous act. He made a YouTube or Facebook video saying why this violence from Gaza is happening, these clashes at the border with Israeli forces. And this may seem strange, perhaps or perhaps not, why that would be courageous to make a video. But it is courageous because this is something which is hardly ever done. This kind of external communication, trying to explain and humanize and try to depict the reality for Palestinians in this way from Palestinians in Gaza. This is a very courageous act. Those in Gaza, I have said in years past in my political analysis, suffer from 3 sieges. One is, of course, an Israeli Egyptian siege, which physically imprisons them and keeps their economies at bay, non-existent economies. The second siege is the international diplomatic siege, which keeps Palestinians stuck there, unable to get the travel permits, unable to get any kind of diplomatic status to be recognized to travel. Of course, we as British citizens have passports which can take us around the world as a gold ticket. And the third siege in Gaza is the kind of pressure cooker of occupation's effects, of cultural, let's say, cultural conservatism that keeps, in a sense, expression of frustration sometimes and somewhat at bay. There are kind of 3 tiers of siege and besiegement, particularly on the youth of Gaza. And so making this kind of video that we saw from this young gentleman this week is in fact very courageous and very applaudable. We don't react as those in the West to the world as it is. And this is really important for me. We don't react to the world as it is. We react to the world as we see it, which is often how it's presented to us, often by the mainstream media. Myself as a personal example, I earlier this year was the lead reporter on a series of reports on the UK's immigration removal centres for RT. I went inside a couple of times and met some young men who were, well, both of them in fact were self-harming. One was an Afghan young man who had been in the immigration removal centre for several months, if not a year and a half, if I remember correctly, with no prospect of release or freedom. He tried to commit suicide once, twice even, and guards had found him in his cell. They live in prison-like cell blocks with numbers as if they're prisoners. I myself honestly had no idea that the UK's immigration removal centres were so outrageous until I saw them and heard the testimony with my own ears and eyes. So we don't react to the world as it is. We react to the world as we see it and as we're shown it. And working for RT for me myself is great because I can be part of an effort to show people what otherwise they wouldn't see, to be, in other words, part of an alternative news effort. The refugee crisis had gone on for years before suddenly there was mass public sympathy and attention that we've seen since the summer particularly, and the image of, for example, the young Syrian boy washed up on the Turkish beach. And I think that example of that tragedy particularly gives weight to the fact that we react to what we see, not react to the world as it really is. The UK's Save the Children charity has a very powerful campaign, and often on their videos they say just because it's not happening here doesn't mean it's not happening at all. In their videos they often portray London boroughs as if they're districts of Damascus, for example, to try to get people to make a parallel between what they are experiencing and as if it was happening here. And I applaud and love that kind of effort that draws people in to realize that crises that have been going on for years, in the case of the refugee crisis, and similar ones, are happening now. They are emergencies for thousands or even millions of people. A quote I heard recently at the UN General Assembly from the President of Ecuador really touched me. I'll read it. I hope this isn't boring. Overcoming poverty, dear friends, is the greatest moral imperative for this planet. Since the first time in the history of humanity, poverty is not a fruit of scarcity of resources or other factors, but rather due to exclusion, which is a fruit of the twisted power structure. And Pope Francis also recently spoke to the same point. It's the unequal global structure which means people are suffering in ways of poverty or in ways of not access to economic opportunities to feed their families. And often we don't see this reality. We're not presented this reality because it doesn't classify itself as new. Therefore, it's not news. But it is the reality. And that also touches and goes back to what I was trying to say earlier with the sense of the Hunger Games. Sorry to essentialize it and to put it in such a kind of familial cultural reference. I'm not trying to patronize the situation. But that is the sense of people trying to get to District 1 in so many cases I've seen in recent months. And I also want to challenge all of us today, including myself, of course, to think about another thing too. In a talk I gave a couple of years ago, I had scripted but failed to actually say, perhaps because I didn't have the guts to confront the audience at the time. But do we know, surely we're not often presented with the reality, but do we know the reality of how our iPhones or Samsung phones are perhaps made? I have an iPhone. I'm not going to pretend to be a hypocrite. We are, in a sense, all hypocrites to some extent. But do we know how these phones are made and the conditions in which these are made? Often appalling conditions, according to reports from 2013, 2012, suggesting that people are basically somewhat imprisoned in factories, mass centers, almost like cities unto themselves, with suicide prevention nets around the buildings. Do we know that this is going on? Perhaps we do now. But do we change our behavior? I don't know. The irony of me talking about the phones and the production is that one of the things we can draw most hope from is social media, which is so often facilitated by these phones. And I bring this up because of the complexity of the world and me wanting to underscore that today. As one of the speakers spoke about earlier, the power of social media and the access, the technologies we have today are of revolutionary value and importance. I was very inspired in 2008-9, I think it was, by a quote that George Galloway brought up. Wickedness will never triumph upon the earth because God is great and God will always open people's hearts to the truth. I ask you to spread the truth as an antidote to their lies. He was talking about Islamophobia. And I found that quote very inspiring and energetic and powerful. And I myself began a journey of trying to use technology and social media and etc. to, the best I could in my humble way, spread the truth as an antidote to lies, particularly on the Israel-Palestine conflict my life's journey took me. Television news often gives us such an inaccurate representation of reality. And there's one thing I wish, which is of course an impossible fantasy, but I wish that television news had at the beginning and end of every bulletin the following quote. It's ironically from a February 2012 news briefing in which the US Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld no less, said, among other things, the following very eloquently, incidentally. Bear with me. He continued, "As we know, there are known knowns, there are things we know, we also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we don't know, but there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know. And I just wish that that was plastered on news bulletins, because then we would be able to take with a much more accurate and energetic pinch of salt what we're presented with as reality. Social media is indeed of revolutionary importance in facilitating spreading of information and opening our eyes to what is going on, how our phones are made, what is going on in Gaza, why youth are throwing stones, and etc. And in the last few years, we've seen an explosion in the use of this technology. Even the mainstream channels have been able to keep up with it, now really transfer their dominance from, to a large extent, the traditional means of communicating and broadcasting to all of us to that parallel world of social media too, to an extent. The world is suddenly so much smaller because of social media as well. We can befriend and communicate and have our hearts with others even thousands of miles away. And earlier last year, I was in Malaysia talking about Islamic concepts, incidentally, in relation to social media efforts. And I will quickly, because I have no idea, unfortunately, how much time I have left, hopefully hurriedly draw on that. For me, I have a jihad, if you will, a struggle, a strife, an effort to try to spread the truth as an antidote to lies on social media. And I try to do it with consciousness of a global ummah, a vision of humanity which is not particularly religious, but is one of a shared humanity. And I try in the best way I can to always seek motivation from almost an obsessive, compulsive relationship with the concept of jihad, in a sense, continually struggling for this goal. And I try to do it with, and bear with me, I'm of course no scholar, but I believe the concept is pronounced itqan, which is, as far as I know, a concept in Islam which is to do with completeness of effort and trying to seek not perfection so much, but as a sense of whole in one's output or creation. And I use that to try to, sorry, I thought you were going to pass me a message saying hurry up. So I was just bracing myself for that. So in my efforts, with whatever I do at work or whatever, social media, advocacy, whatever, I try my best to do that job with itqan as well. And I find those concepts inspiring. Jihad, ummah, and itqan. However, social media also, and I have discovered this in the last few years, has, in a sense, drawbacks which are very serious and that we should be very aware of. And I would like to just touch on them a little bit. In a sense, social media is so powerful, it's made the spreading of propaganda even easier. It's made the spreading of misinformation at a political level even easier. It's made spreading lies at a personal level even easier. It also has the danger of helping essentialize and reduce complex realities down to simple truths and simple facts. For example, in the UK context particularly perhaps, and this might be the best example, but it's an example. In the UK political narrative, and earlier I was talking about the UK political scene, to go back to that, we often see the migration crisis, as the BBC would call it, and the refugee crisis, as others would call it, almost as synonymous as an issue with the Syria war crisis, as it's called. These issues are in no stretch of the imagination synonymous, but in the UK context, talking about the refugee crisis almost automatically leads into talking about the Syria war crisis. In other countries, in other nations, in other discourses, this isn't the case. Another concern I have with social media is the ability to create massive polarization. particularly with the Israel-Palestine conflict. I've seen it in my own experience. That individuals will reject detail, they will reject nuance, they will reject any contradictory information which goes up against their worldview, and they will ignore any grey area of fact which goes against their worldview. I've seen raw hatred spreaded about Palestinians. We've perhaps all seen it in recent days and the way we get our news and our information to do with all of these stabbing attacks or alleged stabbing attacks and all of the Palestinians and Israeli lives caught up in this. Is that the piece of paper with hurry up on it? No. Sorry? Okay. So I totally lost my train of thought. Stabbing attacks, Israeli and Palestinian lives. I've seen raw hatred brought up in reaction to all of these stories against Palestinians, as if people have forgotten that Palestinians are humans. But I've also seen, to the same extent, people forgetting that Israelis are humans. And surely the same values which mean that we care that Palestinians are humans should mean that Israelis are also humans. And it may not be popular to say that, but it is the truth. And if we cannot accept that, then we must have a problem within ourselves. Also the ability, I have 1 minute, so I'm in negative time, excuse me. Also the ability for us to have emotional reactions to news and realities, which are actually more to do with the emotional reaction than reality. And people have made the point that an example of this, and I don't entirely agree with this, but people have made the point, an example of this is the raising of the Palestinian flag at the United Nations, headquarters in New York. Does this actually help the Palestinian in Gaza who is having to explain why he's throwing stones? Does this help the Palestinian young man who feels he has no way in life but to perhaps sacrifice his own life, to martyr himself? I don't think so. Because I've talked about all of these strange and abstract topics and talked about so many depressing issues, I want to try and bring it all together and then leave you in peace by talking about hope. Me, myself, given what I've seen from Gaza to the West Bank, to Israel, to the migrant camp in Calais, and also across the countries caught up in the so-called refugee flow crisis. To a large extent, I have to admit, I've lost at that level objective hope. But at another level, this level, I haven't lost hope. And in a sense, I haven't lost irrational hope. In the last couple of weeks, few weeks, the UK Prime Minister had to do a U-turn on how we reacted to the refugee crisis, accepting a paltry, but at least something, 20,000 Syrian refugees. That happened because of social media and activist efforts, period. That is the reason why it happened, and that should give us hope. And I'll leave you now, but reading a couple of quotes again from Chris Hedges talking about hope in this Western context that we can relate to. Hope is not comfortable or easy. Hope requires personal risk. It is not about the right attitude or peace of mind. Hope is action. Hope is doing something. The more futile, the more useless, the more irrelevant and incomprehensible an act of rebellion is, the vaster and more potent hope becomes. Hope never makes sense. Hope is weak, unorganized, and absurd. Hope, which is always non-violent, knows that an injustice visited on our neighbor is an injustice visited on all of us. Hope posits that people are drawn to the good by the good. This is the secret of hope's power. Hope demands for others what we demand for ourselves. Hope does not separate us from them. Hope sees in our enemy our own face. Hope is what the corporate state, which saturates our airwaves with lies, seeks to obliterate. Hope is what this corporate state is determined to crush. Be afraid, they tell us. The powerful do not understand hope. Hope is not part of their vocabulary. They divide the world into the damned and the blessed, the patriots and the enemy, the privileged and the weak. Any act of rebellion, any physical defiance of those who make war, of those who perpetuate corporate greed, are responsible for state crimes. Anything that seeks to draw the good to the good nourishes our souls and holds out the possibility that we can touch and transform the souls of others. And every act that imparts hope is a victory in itself. Thanks.